Hello and welcome everyone. Today we are going to be covering chapter 4, and chapter 4 is all about tissues. So this is a long chapter, and usually I cover it with 2 lectures. So the lecture overview, we're going to be talking about epithelial tissue, connective tissue, and then some coverings and membranes, which we've already talked a little bit about membranes, if you remember back to our first lecture. So that's kind of a combination of epithelial and connective tissue. So we're going to be talking about that. Muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and then how does tissue respond to injury, right? What happens if we cut ourselves? What happens? And then how does tissues evolve throughout life? What happens as we age? Okay. So now what are tissues, right? So remember back to our first lecture and we talked about the hierarchy of structural organization and how we kind of have small things building up to bigger and bigger things. So we said that cells come together to create tissues. So when we have some cells that are kind of performing the same functions, very similar in structure and shape, then these are going to come together and create a tissue. And we have 4 basic tissue types and functions. So we're going to cover all 4 of these tissues in this lecture, but we're going to focus a lot more on epithelial and connective tissue, because when we get to the muscles and the nervous system, we're going to cover muscle tissue and the nervous tissue in a lot more detail. So first, epithelial tissue. Really think anything that covers or lines a surface, whether that be an external surface or an internal surface of the body. And then connective tissue is probably our broadest category, and really think support. So, a classic connective tissue would be like a tendon or a ligament, but again, it's a very broad category, so some of the tissues don't quite fall into the support category, but we'll talk extensively about that. And then muscles, right? Muscles produce movement. It's a very specialized tissue that is able to contract and produce movement. And then nervous tissue, right? We said the nervous system is for the control of the body. So the nervous tissue is very specialized in the cells and being able to create impulses and electrical impulses. So again, we're going to cover muscle and tissue a little bit more extensively later in the course. So let's start with our epithelial tissue. We said that it's going to cover a body surface or line a body cavity. So we talked a lot about the different body cavities in our first lecture, right? We have the dorsal body cavities and the ventral body cavities. So lots of surface area to cover in the body, and that's the job of the epithelial tissue. Another job is it does form a large part of glands, and so we'll talk a little bit more about glands and their ducts. So the duct part of the gland is going to be made up of epithelial tissue. So what are some functions of the epithelial tissue? We said it covers body surfaces, lines body cavities. So a big one you can think about is protection, right? Think of your skin. So your skin is part epithelial tissue. So very protective, right? It protects everything underneath. And then when you think about the glands, you think of secretion, such as your salivary glands. And then when we're lining these different body cavities and internal structures, you're going to think absorption in the intestines, diffusion in the lungs, filtration in the kidneys, and you also get some sensory reception in the skin as well. So lots of different functions of the epithelial tissue. Okay, but kind of really focus on the protection part and maybe the absorption, diffusion. Kind of those are the biggies for me and for this course. So what are some special characteristics of epithelial tissue? What makes epithelial tissue different than connective tissue, muscle, and nervous tissue? Well, when you look at epithelial tissue, it has a high cellularity. And what does that mean? That means that the cells are very close together. So they're packed in together, and there's very little what we call extracellular matrix or extracellular material. And that's anything around the cells, okay, in the tissue. So they're kind of crammed together, and they have these specialized contacts. So because they're all smushed up against each other, their surfaces are going to be touching. And they're actually joined by special junctions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And if you notice on our picture on the right-hand side, these cells look a little bit different, right? The top of the cell looks a little different from the side of the cell, a little bit different from the bottom. So again, this is called polarity. So that means all surfaces differ from each other. Maybe the sides look a little bit similar, but again, the apical surface, or the top part, is different than the basal surface, or the bottom part. So that's called polarity. So epithelial cells have polarity. They're also really good at regeneration. So if you think about your skin, right, you're sloughing off skin cells every day, all day long. So there has to be a great system to replace all those cells constantly. So there's a quick turnover using cell division. So these cells are undergoing cellular division all the time. Also, whenever you see an epithelial tissue, it's going to be supported by a connective tissue. So again, if we look at our picture, we have our epithelial cells up at the top here, and then you notice there's this pink tissue underneath, and that is the connective tissue. So there's always going to be a connective tissue associated with an epithelial tissue. And the reason why we always have a connective tissue is because the connective tissue is what brings in all the nutrients. They have the blood stream and the blood vessels within that connective tissue, because we don't see blood vessels in epithelial tissue, it's just cells. Okay, so these cells need the nutrients to survive, and that's brought in by that connective tissue. So they do have their own nerve supply, so they do have some nerves up in this epithelial tissue, but again, we don't have any vasculature, any blood vessels. Okay, so the connective tissue is what brings in the nutrients and oxygen from the blood vessels. So now we have a bunch of different types of epithelial tissue, and how do we name them? How do we say this is this type of epithelial tissue, and maybe in that tissue we have a different type, or that organ we have a different type? So the first name, so every epithelial tissue is going to have two names. The first name is going to tell us the number of cells in the layer. Okay, so if we have a simple epithelial tissue, it's just a single layer of cells. So if we look over here at our picture, we have just one layer of cells, and they're all squished up next to each other, right? They're all connected in a single row. If we have a stratified epithelial tissue, then it's going to be multiple layers, so at least 2 layers, okay? And it then is considered stratified. So we always are going to have one layer on the basement membrane attached to that connective tissue underneath, and then we're going to have at least one more layer. And then the second name is going to describe the shape of the cell. So not all epithelial cells look the same, are shaped the same way. So first we have squamous cells, and squamous cells are a little wider than they are tall. If you think of kind of a fried egg, that's what it looks like, right? So really flattened, very wide. Whereas cuboidal is going to look more like a cube, right? It's as wide as it is tall. And then columnar is going to be taller than it is wide. It looks like a column, right? So they're named very appropriately, and hopefully that'll help you remember the names of the different tissues. So let's go through each individual epithelial tissue. So remember, they're all named with two names. So our first is our simple squamous. So we're going to have just a single layer of those flattened, kind of fried egg-like cells. And it's really the simplest form of epithelial tissue. And if you think about it, it's such a thin layer. This is really not going to provide any sort of protection, but things maybe can pass through it very easily because it's so thin. So this is really important for diffusion and filtration, things where you want things to be able to pass through that epithelial tissue without much trouble. So where might we find this tissue? Well, we find it in the kidneys, in the glomeruli, okay? But this picture is of an air sac in the lung. So here is one air sac of the lung, or one alveoli. And so it's going to line that air sac, okay? And what did we say happens in the respiratory system, in the lungs? We're going to get all this gas exchange, right? So we want to be able to have the oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse very easily through that epithelial tissue and into the bloodstream, okay? So we also see it in the lining of blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, okay? So we do see it throughout the body, the simple squamous. So it's a very common epithelial tissue throughout the body. Our next type of epithelial tissue is simple cuboidal. So we said these guys look like cubes. So it's a single layer because it's simple. And it has these cuboidal cells with a very central spherical nuclei. So the nucleus sits kind of right in the middle of the cell. And these guys are for secretion and absorption. So things are going to be secreting out or absorbing in. Okay, so we find this in the kidneys, so in the kidney tubules. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of absorbing and secreting in the kidney tubules, and we'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the urinary system. We find it in ducts, okay, in small glands, and in the ovaries as well. So if we look over here at our picture, here's a tubule of the kidney. So you see the basement membrane, it's kind of a brighter pink circle. And then each of these individual cells are going to be butted right up against each other in the circle. They look kind of like fluffy donuts. Okay, so this is one kidney tubule here. Okay, then you have some connective tissue in between and in amongst those tubules, right? Because we always have a connective tissue associated with our epithelial tissue. Now here's our simple columnar. So again, it's a one layer of cells, but these guys are much taller than they are wide. Okay, so they look more like columns. And they can have cilia or microvilli on top. That's kind of looks like this little hairy brush border on the top. So it just depends on where that epithelial tissue is in the body. Okay, and if you notice that the nuclei are a little bit different as well. They're not as spherical, they're a little more elongated, and they may not be right in the center of the cell. They may be a little more basal, meaning a little more toward the bottom of the cell. And these guys are really for absorption as well and secretion. So very similar to our simple cuboidal in terms of function, but again it has some of this cilia that may help propel mucus by the ciliary action. And we'll talk a little bit more about what the ciliary action is in a minute. So depending on if it has cilia or not, in the different types of the body, in the different areas of the body, you'll see these different types. So you get some non-ciliated in the digestive tract. So in the majority of the digestive tract, you see simple columnar epithelium. And then if you see ciliated, it's going to be kind of in the respiratory system, so small bronchi. In the uterine tube, so in the reproductive system in the female, because you want to be able to move the egg through the uterine tube. So you get this ciliary action to kind of move things through. Same with the respiratory system. You want to move that mucus through the respiratory tract and out. Okay. So simple columnar epithelium. So here's one of my favorite and kind of more confusing epithelium because it's called pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And usually it's ciliated, which is why we call it ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And I definitely want you guys to know this epithelium. So why is it pseudo-stratified? Well, that means it's like a false stratified. It may look stratified because the nuclei are kind of all over the place, but it's really a single layer of cells. But what the difference is these columnar cells, some don't reach the top, some don't reach the bottom, so they're not like the simple columnar where each cell goes top to bottom. So these cells are all kind of various, lengths. They don't always go top to bottom. So they're very different. And you notice that all the nuclei are not perfectly lined up in the center of the cells. Okay. So what is this epithelium good for? Well, it's really for secretion. Okay, so it's found in the majority in the respiratory system, the upper respiratory tract, such as the trachea. And the big thing is it has this cilia on the top, so these long kind of finger-like projections. And it has these cells called goblet cells, which are full of mucus. And we'll talk a little bit about the goblet cells in a minute. So essentially, it produces a lot of mucus, and so for secretion. And then what the cilia does is it actually pushes in a wave all that mucus in one direction. And you might think, why do we want mucus in our respiratory tract? Well, say you breathe in a bunch of dust and air particles. Well, you don't want that getting into your lungs. So you trap it in the mucus, and then the cilia propels it up and into the throat where you can then swallow it so that it doesn't go into the lungs. So again, we really find this type of tissue mostly in the upper respiratory tract, like the trachea, and it's very important in the respiratory system. Okay, and we'll talk a bit more about it later too. So those were our simple epithelial tissues. Now we're going to talk about our stratified epithelium. So our first one is stratified squamous. So remember, squamous is the fried egg. And it's really named, especially when we're talking about stratified epithelial tissue, it's named for what the top layers of the cells look like. Okay, so if we look at it, all these top layers of the cells are squished and flattened, right? So they are those true squamous epithelial cells. But if you look towards the bottom, so the whole layer of the tissue goes from about here to here. So many, many layers of cells, right? But if you look towards the bottom, they don't look quite as squished. They're maybe a little more cuboidal. So again, we're named for that top layers of cells, okay? Now, stratified squamous epithelium, you think, okay, there's so many layers of cells. This might be for protection, okay? Because there's so many layers of cells, we are protecting all the tissue underneath. Okay, so this tissue type is going to be found in areas that are subject to abrasion, okay? And the other big part about this tissue is you can have a layer of keratin or not. And keratin, think like your fingernails or your hair, right? It's very hard substance, okay? So this keratin layer makes it even more protective. And so where might you need the most protection? Your skin, right? So the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium is going to be in your skin. Okay, and we'll talk a lot more about this when we talk about the skin and the integumentary system. Okay, but we do have some areas internally inside the body that we need non-keratinized type of stratified squamous epithelium. So think your mouth, right? So you're going to be eating maybe some abrasive food, right? Have you ever had a chip poke the top of your mouth or your cheek, right? It hurts. Well, you need that protection from those abrasive things. So the stratified squamous epithelium, non-keratinized, is going to line the oral cavity, your esophagus, right? So you're swallowing that food, and the vagina as well. So any kind of opening to the outside of the world that may find some sort of abrasive substance. So now we have stratified cuboidal epithelium. So again, we only have really 2 layers of cells, but it is stratified because it's more than 1. So it's at least 2, right? So this is also for protection, and this is going to be found in larger ducts. So we said the smaller ducts are just going to be the simple cuboidal. So these guys are going to be found in some large glands, such as sweat glands, mammary glands, salivary glands. So this is for protection, okay? And then our last stratified tissue is stratified columnar. So again, that top layer looks like columnar cells. So the bottom layers might be a little more cuboidal, but that top layer is what is columnar. And this is for protection and secretion. And we don't find this very often in the body. It's a very rare tissue in the body, but we do find it only in small amounts in the male urethra, okay? And in some large ducts of some glands. So we don't see too much of this type of tissue, okay? Now our last but not least, another of my favorites because it's kind of strange, is called transitional epithelium. So it is a stratified epithelium, but it doesn't have a name of a cell shape because the shape changes. Okay, that's why it's called transitional. So these cells can go from more of a cuboidal shape to more of a squamous-like shape. Okay, so it's going to be found in organs that the tissue can stretch. Okay, where might we see stretching in our body? Well, in the bladder. So very common in the urinary tract. So it lines the ureters, the bladder, and parts of the urethra. Okay, so that bladder has to be able to distend and allow for the urine to collect in the bladder. Okay, so these top cells up here that look kind of fluffy and a little bit more like a cuboidal cell is going to be able to stretch, really flatten out when the bladder stretches. Okay, so kind of the cool epithelium. But again, it's going to help protect the wall of the bladder. So it is a lining of epithelium. So I know that was a lot, and there's different types of epithelial tissue, but there's a great table in your book, figure 4.11, and so it really kind of breaks down the different epithelial tissues. So it's a great way to maybe make some flashcards to help you remember these different types of epithelial tissues. Okay? So definitely know your different types, a little bit about the function and where that type might be found in the body, right? So function and location. So now we're going to talk a little bit about glands. So we have 2 broad categories of glands. We have endocrine glands and exocrine glands. So what's the difference between them? Okay, so endocrine glands are ductless. Okay, so they secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream. And we'll talk a lot more about the endocrine system and hormones in chapter 17. Okay, what we're worried about for this chapter are exocrine glands. So these guys have a duct. So the gland is going to produce some sort of secretion, and then the duct has to carry that secretion to the epithelial surface. Okay, whether that be the surface of the skin or the surface inside of a lining of the digestive system, whatever that may be. So the different types of secretions could be mucus, sweat, oil, saliva, right? Or even enzymes in like the pancreas, okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about these guys. So we have two main types of exocrine glands, okay? So we have a unicellular gland, so one cell. Okay, so it only has one cell, and we've seen these guys before. And these are goblet cells. So they produce mucin. Okay, so mucin is essentially what makes up mucus. Okay, it's just the secretion in mucus. And what this does is it really protects and lubricates a lot of internal body surfaces, such as the digestive tract, the respiratory tract. So remember, we saw this in that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which lines the trachea and that upper respiratory tract. This is just a different picture of it. So instead of kind of white substance in the goblet cell, we have, it's just a different stain. So it's stained green. So this is one goblet cell here. Okay. But you can see that cilia across the top there. So this is just a higher magnification of this tissue. So we see goblet cells all over, mostly in, the simple columnar epithelium and that pseudostratified columnar epithelium, okay? But now we have multicellular exocrine glands. So these guys are our bigger glands, okay? And we have two basic parts. So we have the duct, right, which is the epithelium tissue, the epithelial tissue. And that's going to be either simple or stratified cuboidal, usually, right? Just depending on the size of the gland and the size of the duct, okay? And then you have the secretory unit. So whatever the cells that are producing the saliva or the sweat or the oil or the mucus. So whatever is producing that secretion is the secretory unit. So those cells are specialized cells to produce that secretion. And then it's carried through the duct, which is the epithelial tissue. So let's talk a little bit more about the multicellular exocrine glands. Okay, so how do we classify and categorize these glands? Okay, so we have a classification is by the structure of the duct. So does it branch or does it not branch? So if it only has one duct, then it's simple. So there's no branches. But if it has some branches, looks maybe like a tree, right? So you have the trunk and then you've got some branches coming off of it, then it's compound, okay? Now, how do we categorize them? Well, this is by the secretory unit. So the classification is by the duct and the category is by the secretion. So if the cells look like tubes, they're tubular. So tubular. Or if they're more rounded, they're alveolar, okay? And there are some that look a little bit like both, like a little tube and round. So those would be tubulo-alveolar. So it's kind of a combination of the two. So this might help us look at these classifications of glands, okay? So these are a simple duct, so it doesn't branch. So we have just one main duct, okay, right here. So even though this has a couple secretory units on it, we just have the one duct, okay? So this would be more tubular, okay? And these would be more alveolar. So these guys are rounded. Again, these guys are both simple. These guys are tubular. These guys are alveolar, okay? Now, if we look at the compounded ones, so these guys do have branches. So again, think of like a tree. So you've got your main trunk or duct, and then you've got a couple branches coming off of that before you get to the secretory unit. Okay? So these guys are a little more tubular, elongated. These guys are a little more rounded, so they're alveolar. And again, you can get these combos that are a little more, they look kind of a combination of tubule and alveolar. Okay, so tubulo-alveolar. Okay. So now we're going to change gears a little bit and go through those specialized features of epithelial cells in a little more detail. So we said that they're polarized, so they have polarity. So each surface looks a little bit different. So let's look at the lateral surfaces first. And remember our directional terms. So the lateral, so if we have kind of a midline through the cell, right? If you cut the cell in half, then lateral means kind of away from midline, right? So these would be the lateral surfaces. So we have some cell junctions because we said these cells are kind of stuck together, right? So they're bound together. And so we have some special junctions to keep these cells together. So we have three different types of these cell junctions. One is called tight junctions. Then we have desmosomes. And then we have gap junctions. So let's go through all three of those types of junctions. So here's a picture from your book that gives a great detail. And again, you don't need to know too much detail about these three types of junctions, but let's just go through them to get an idea. So tight junctions, just like the word suggests, it's tight. So that means it's impermeable. So that means, so these are the tight junctions across here, keeping these cells together. If there's something trying to go in between the cells, they're not going to be able to pass. Okay, impermeable. So any sort of molecules that are trying to pass in between this intracellular space, they're not going to be able to. Okay, so that's what's important about the tight junctions. And again, the name kind of helps us out. Now the desmosomes I think are kind of complex, and again you don't need to know anything about these linker proteins or anything like that. Just know that the desmosomes are helpful in reducing the internal tension between the cells. So again, remember they're stuck together and there may be movement, right? So it's going to help release some of the tension between the two cells. Okay, so it kind of gives it a little bit of a buffering system, kind of a cushion. Okay, that's these plaques. Okay, but again, you don't need to know all the details of how the desmosome complex is made up. Okay, so our last type of junction is a gap junction. So that's at the bottom here. So just like the name suggests, again, is there's a gap. So it allows for a connection between the cells with an open channel. Okay, so this allows molecules to pass from inside one cell to another. Okay, so this allows for intercellular communication. So it allows the cells to talk to each other. Okay, so tight junctions, desmosomes, and gap junctions. So we talked about the lateral surfaces of the cell. Now we're going to talk about the basal surface. Okay, so the basal meaning bottom. Okay, so now these guys are what are associated with the underlying connective tissue. So we said all epithelial tissue has an underlying connective tissue with it. Okay. So these cells are going to be attached to what's called the basement membrane. So this is that line here that you can kind of see that delineates between epithelial tissue and connective tissue. Okay. So there is a basal lamina, which is between the epithelial tissue and the connective tissue, okay? And it's just a sheet of protein, okay, that makes up part of the basement membrane, okay? So what is the function of the basement membrane? Okay, well, it is a selective filter. That means that it decides, it's kind of like a gated community. It decides what it's going to allow to enter from that underlying connective tissue. Okay, so there are the blood vessels and things that are carrying all this oxygen and nutrients, things that the epithelial tissue really, really wants. So it's going to allow those molecules to enter, but it doesn't want other things, okay? And also it provides a scaffolding for the cells to attach to. Okay, so these cells are attached, and what happens is this is where all that cellular division is happening. Okay, because we said, remember, it's very good at regenerating. Okay, so it's going to divide down here, provide some attachment for it, and then the cells could migrate upward, especially in those stratified epithelial tissues. Okay, so the basal lamina is what makes up, the basement membrane is composed of both the basal lamina and that connective tissue underneath. Okay, so the basal lamina is part of the epithelial tissue, and then the basement membrane has that connective tissue as well. Okay, a lot of people get confused between basement membrane and basal lamina. They're very similar. Okay, basal lamina is more part of the epithelial tissue. It's kind of the delineation between the two. Then the basement membrane includes that connective tissue underneath. Okay, they're somewhat interchangeable, and so that's why it's confusing. Okay, but usually we refer to it as the basement membrane. So now we talked about the sides, the lateral surfaces, the bottom or the basal surface, and now we're going to talk about the superficial surface or the apical surface. Okay, so what are some special features about this apical surface? Well, we said that they can have those kind of little projections coming off the tops of the cells. So we have a couple different types of projections. And the first type is microvilli. And these guys are little finger-like extensions of the plasma membrane of the cell. Okay, and what it does is it increases the surface area of the cell. So this is really important if you're trying to absorb nutrients or secrete things from the cell. Okay, so it increases that surface area, which is really important in the digestive system, especially in the small intestine, as well as in the kidney tubules. Okay, so we're doing a lot of absorbing and secreting in both of those areas. So now I kind of talked a bit about how cool the cilia is, and the cilia actually has its own movement. So it actually has this whip-like movement or motile movement that essentially moves in one direction. So we said it's very common in that pseudostratified columnar epithelium, which is found in the reproductive tract. So here's our little cilia, and essentially it makes this little whip-like movement, and so it traps the mucus and pushes it and propels it forward. So essentially all that mucus is going to be traveling in one direction because the cilia just continues to push it that way. Okay? So very important because we trap all that dust and debris in the respiratory tract, and then we want to get it out of the respiratory tract. So we're going to push it out, and that's the whole job of the cilia and the mucus. And then we have those little goblet cells that are producing that mucin, right, which is what's making up the mucus. And those are those single-celled excretory cells. So let's have a little review of epithelial tissue. So maybe pause the video and write down these answers for yourself, right? So tell me, what are some functions of the epithelial tissue? What are some of those special characteristics that we talked about? And what are those different types of epithelial tissue? How did we name them, right? So hopefully you were able to pause the video and maybe come up with these answers on your own. So what are some functions? Well, we said a big one is protection, right? It's going to protect the body coverings, either inside or outside. We see it do some absorption, secretion, diffusion, just depending on where it is in the body and what it's lining, right? So whether it's a gland for secretion, respiratory system for diffusion, and then absorption and secretion in the digestive and urinary tracts. And the special characteristics, we said it has high cellularity, lots of cells packed together, right? Polarity, all the different surfaces of the cell are different. And you can come up with some other ones as well, right? We said it's very good at regeneration, okay? It always has connective tissue associated with it. Now, what are the different types, okay? We said there's simple versus stratified, right? And then we have squamous, cuboidal, and columnar, which are the different shapes of the cells, and then you put those together with the simple and stratified. And then we have our two special types, right? Our pseudostratified columnar and our transitional, okay? So now let's talk about our second type of tissue, and that's going to be connective tissue. So this is really the most diverse and most abundant tissue in the body. So essentially, if it's not an epithelial tissue, if it's not muscle, and it's not nervous tissue, it's going to be connective tissue. So it's really found everywhere in the body. So what are our main classes of connective tissue? Well, we have connective tissue proper, which I know that seems kind of strange, but you're really going to think like ligaments and tendons, things like that. And we have cartilage. So cartilage is a connective tissue. Bone. Bone is a connective tissue, you may not think it is, as well as blood. And blood is the weirdest one of all. So there's a reason why blood is considered a connective tissue, even though it may not fall in all the right categories of connective tissue. So what are some functions? So again, we're going to have a wide range of function because we have a big diverse class of tissue. So it forms the basis of the skeleton, right? Obviously, if bone tissue is a connective tissue, then it's going to form the majority of the skeleton. It stores and carries nutrients. So remember, the bones can store nutrients. Fat stores nutrients. Okay, so fat is a connective tissue as well. And it's carrying nutrients in the blood, right? It surrounds the blood vessels and nerves. Okay, so we said the epithelial tissue lines the blood vessels on the inside, but again, every epithelial tissue is going to have connective tissue associated with it. Okay, and it leads the fight against infection. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the immune system, but we produce our blood cells in the bone marrow. Okay. So we talked about our special characteristics of epithelial tissue. So what are the special characteristics of connective tissue? And again, it's such a diverse class that there are certain things that connective tissue does follow in terms of the classification of it. So we said epithelial tissue has a ton of cells, right? High cellularity, very little extracellular substances. Well, this is the exact opposite in connective tissue. There are very few cells, but a lot of extracellular substances, which we call matrix, okay? So the extracellular matrix, what is it made up of? It's kind of a strange name. Just think extracellular is outside the cell. Okay, so anything outside the cell. Well, what is that made up of? It's going to be made up of ground substance, okay, which we'll talk about what that is, and fibers. Okay, there's different types of fibers. And both of these substances are produced by the cells themselves. So they're going to be producing and secreting all this extracellular matrix that those cells are now living in. Okay. They all have a common embryonic origin. So they all come from mesenchyme. Okay, so it's an embryonic tissue. And that's why we include blood in this category, because blood comes from mesenchyme. Okay, and this picture is of mesenchymal tissue. Okay, so this is mesenchymal tissue. So classic connective tissue, we have very few cells sitting in amongst all of this extracellular matrix. Okay, pretty much everything else. And you see these little pink lines. Well, those are fibers. Okay, so we have fibers, and then all the white in the background, that's ground substance. It's kind of like a jelly-like substance. Okay. So now let's break down the components of connective tissue, or those structural elements. So first we're going to talk about those cells. Okay, we said there's very few cells in connective tissue. And each individual connective tissue has a primary cell type. And we said that those cells are what are going to be producing that extracellular matrix. So if we're talking about the connective tissue proper, those are going to be fibroblasts. Okay, so the fibroblasts are the cell type in that connective tissue proper, and they're going to be producing all the ground substance and fibers. Okay. If we're talking about cartilage, the cells in cartilage are called chondroblasts. Okay. And if we're talking about that bone, they're osteoblasts. Okay, so if we look at our three pictures over here, we're going to have connective tissue proper up here. And if you see the little purple dots, those are our fibroblasts, which are our cells. And they're going to be producing these fibers, these pink and purple lines that you see, as well as that pink background ground substance. Okay. In the next picture, we have cartilage. So if you notice these little dots within these kind of white spots, those are those chondrocytes. Okay. And then last but not least, we have bone. Okay. And then we have these little bone cells, or osteoblasts. Okay. And we'll talk more about bone tissue when we talk about bones as well. Okay. So we have three types of cells in bone and tissue. So osteoblasts are one of the three types. Okay. So osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. Okay. So don't get confused about that. So there are other cells that we do see in connective tissue, okay, but not in all connective tissues. So we do see fat cells, right, in fat tissue or adipose tissue. We see white blood cells, right? So there might be some white blood cells or some mast cells hanging around, okay? But they're not the ones that are going to be producing that extracellular matrix. And when we talk about blood, yes, we have blood cells within the blood, but they do not produce the plasma, which is kind of a liquid extracellular matrix, right? That's the fluid of the blood. So again, it doesn't follow the rule here, but it does come from that mesenchymal tissue. So we talked about cells in our connective tissue. Now let's talk about the extracellular matrix, all the other stuff that's being produced by those cells. Okay, so we have fibers, and these guys are really going to function in support. Remember, we said connective tissue is really all about support, and it has some very unique properties. So probably the most common type of fiber is collagen fiber. And this is really the strongest type of fiber there is. It's very resistant to tension. Okay. We do have reticular fibers, and this is kind of a specialized type of collagen. Okay, and we only see it in a very specific type of tissue. And then we have elastic fibers, which contains something called elastin. And what it does is it recoils after stretching. Okay, think of something that is elastic, right? It's able to stretch and recoil. Okay, so that'll come into play in some of our tissues that are able to stretch. So those are the fibers, okay? And now we have ground substance. And essentially it's that kind of a gel-like substance, as I was saying before, and it's made up of these proteins called proteoglycans and glycosaminoglycans. And again, you don't need to know those names of those things. But just know what it does, okay? So it functions kind of as a cushion and protection, okay? And it holds fluid, okay? So it's a gel-like substance. Think of it kind of like gel, right? And it holds fluid. Gel holds fluid, okay? In a more solid state, okay? Now, what are the different types of connective tissue? We said there's so many, right? It's a diverse group, so we've got to break it down a little bit. So when we're talking about connective tissue proper, we have two subclasses of connective tissue proper, okay? And think to ourselves, what are the cells in connective tissue proper? We said fibroblasts, okay? So we're going to be looking for fibroblasts. So loose connective tissue, we have three types of loose connective tissues. Now we have less fibers and more ground substance when we're talking about loose connective tissue. And this is our areolar connective tissue, adipose tissue, which is fat, and reticular connective tissue. So we have three types of these loose connective tissue. But if we look at our picture up here, right, we have our fibroblasts kind of sitting around, those little purple dots. But we have these fibers kind of going in all directions, but you see a lot of the pinkish white background, that ground substance. So it looks very loose, right? It looks kind of disjointed, okay? Versus our dense connective tissue, if we look in comparison, yeah, we see those fibroblasts around, but we see lots of fibers. Okay, it's chock full of fibers. Barely visible is some of that ground substance in between those fibers. So dense fibers. Okay, so kind of loose fibers or less fibers in the loose, dense packed fibers in the dense connective tissue. Less ground substance. So we have three of these types as well. So we have dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic connective tissue. Okay, now regular versus irregular has to do with the fibers and whether they're kind of packed in all one direction, which is regular, which is what this picture is, or are those going all over the place and it looks a little bit more like spaghetti? That's irregular. So we'll look at these examples. So first, we'll review that mesenchymal tissue because it's really our classic connective tissue because it gives rise to all the other connective tissues. And really, we only find it in the embryo, right? The developing embryo. So we have those mesenchymal cells, okay, which are going to become either fibroblasts, chondroblasts, or osteoblasts, right? Or our blood cells. The ground substance and fibers making up all that extracellular matrix, okay? So now let's talk about our first loose connective tissue, and this is our areolar connective tissue. It's the classic loose connective tissue, okay? So it has a gel-like matrix, that ground substance, and it has all three fiber types. So you can see collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers in there, okay? And this is where we see some white blood cells just kind of in amongst the fibroblasts. So our main cell type is the fibroblast. And what areolar tissue does is it's really associated with epithelial tissue. So it is under the majority of our epithelial tissue. So it forms part of that basement membrane, right? So the lamina propria is going to be in between the epithelial tissue and the connective tissue, okay? So it surrounds capillaries, okay? So it surrounds blood vessels. It surrounds different organs, okay? But again, it's a big one that underlies epithelial tissue, okay? It plays an important role in inflammation because it does have a lot of these white blood cells sitting in there. So it's kind of a first line of defense, right? Okay. So our second type of loose connective tissue is the adipose tissue. So this is fat, okay? So these are the fat cells. So they look like these big circles with the little nuclei on the side, because this is a fat droplet. Okay, so it's a big vacuole containing fat. Okay. So there is a lot of ground substance in between, very few fibers. Okay. It's kind of loosely packed, which is why it's loose, but it has a lot of these fat cells kind of packed together. Okay. And really, fat is a store of energy, right? So we store fat so that we can burn it later. But fat also helps to protect and insulate different organs of the body as well. So where do we find it, right? We kind of find fat everywhere if you're me. But you know, it's under the skin, so the hypodermis, so it insulates under the skin. We find it around the kidneys to help protect the kidneys. In the back of the eye, so it's cushioned for our eyeballs. All over the abdomen, right, in between different organs. But it's also the majority of breast tissue. So we have the mammary glands that are producing the milk, but all around the mammary glands is adipose tissue. Right? And that really determines the size of the breast, not necessarily the mammary glands themselves. Okay. So our third and last type of loose connective tissue is the reticular connective tissue. So we said that one of our fiber type is reticular fibers. So again, we have our fibroblasts in here. Okay, and these guys, these dark black lines are the reticular fibers. So they create kind of this internal skeleton, kind of a scaffolding for cells. Okay, so we find this in our lymphoid tissue. So remember, our lymphatic system goes hand in hand with our immune system. So we find this in our lymph nodes, in the spleen, and in the bone marrow. So bone marrow is a big one. So really think immune system and lymphoid organs and lymphoid tissue when you think reticular connective tissue. Okay. So those were the loose connective tissues. Now we're going to talk about the dense connective tissue. So this is dense regular. So again, we have lots of fibers that are all jam-packed together, but they're all in parallel. So they're all going the same direction. Okay. We do see a few elastic fibers, and we do have our fibroblasts. So they're kind of elongated. Okay. So these guys are what make up tendons and ligaments. Okay, so that's kind of what you think of as a classic connective tissue, something that is going to resist force in one direction. Okay, so because those collagen fibers are so strong, they're very good at resisting stress in one direction. Okay, right? Because if you think about what tendons and ligaments do, is they're attaching to the bones and the muscles, and then they have to move those bones and muscles, right? The muscle is what's moving it, but the force from the muscle on that tendon is going to move the bone. Okay, so really think tendons and ligaments. Okay. And again, just as a refresher, and we'll talk more about this later, but a tendon attaches a muscle to a bone, and a ligament attaches a bone to another bone. Okay, so just the difference between a tendon and a ligament, but they're made up of the same material, this dense, irregular connective tissue with those parallel collagen fibers. So they're really good at resisting stress, in one direction. So now what's the difference between dense regular and now we have dense irregular? So I said this one, the collagen fibers look a little bit more like spaghetti, right? They're kind of going all over the place. They're not in those nice parallel arrangement, okay? It's still collagen fibers and we still have our fibroblasts, right? Because we're a connective tissue proper. There are some fat cells in there as well. But because the collagen fibers are going in many directions, it's able to withstand forces in many different directions. So even though maybe a tendon can resist more force, it's only in one direction because it's the direction that all those collagen fibers are running. So when you think of dense irregular, think a capsule. So joint capsules, capsules around organs, and in the dermis of the skin. So in the skins, because your skin can resist force in all directions. Okay. We also find it in the digestive tract as well. Okay. So really think those collagen fibers are going in all directions so it can resist forces in all directions. Okay. So now our last type of dense connective tissue is elastic connective tissue. And we have a bunch of elastic fibers. So again, they're all in parallel, just like our dense regular connective tissue, but we throw in all these elastic fibers. And these elastic fibers are able to recoil after stretching. So we find this tissue type in the walls of large arteries, such as your aorta, right? You have all this blood pressure being ejected from the heart right into the aorta. So it has to allow for some distension in the walls of those arteries, okay? You also see it in some of the bronchial tubes as well in the lungs, but really think the aorta in the large arteries. Okay, to resist all that blood pressure. So now our second type of connective tissue is cartilage. So we talked about all our connective tissue propers. And so cartilage all have very similar structural components. So their extracellular matrix is very firm, right? So think cartilage is very firm. It's not as firm as bone, and we'll talk about why the difference is. But it's flexible. So it's firm and flexible. And the big thing about cartilage is it contains no blood vessels or nerves, which is kind of different for connective tissue, right? Because we said that the connective tissue underlying our epithelial tissue, which is usually areolar connective tissue, is what's bringing in all those blood vessels and nerves. So this is a little bit different, and why cartilage sucks at healing, because it has no blood vessels or nerves, okay? And why it's so firm is because the matrix contains a lot of water. So that ground substance is holding 80% water. So the majority of it is made up of water, okay? Now, when we're talking about cartilage, we're talking about chondroblasts, right? So that's our main cell type. So when we were talking about that connective tissue proper, we talked about fibroblasts. Now we're talking about chondroblasts. So anything with chondro in it is talking about cartilage. Okay. Now, if you see a blast, okay, in the word, blast just means that it's a producing cell. Okay, so it's an active producing cell. So it is creating that extracellular matrix. So it's more of an immature cell producing all that ground substance and fibers. Now, once it has produced all of that extracellular matrix, it becomes a chondrocyte. And so it's more of a mature cartilage cell, no longer producing that extracellular matrix. And because the extracellular matrix is firm, it gets stuck in a little bubble. And that little bubble is called a lacunae. Okay, so if we look at our picture over here, and we have a better blown up version of it, you see all of this dark pink, that's all the ground substance, that's that extracellular matrix. Then you see these white bubbles, that's the lacunae. Then you see a little dark spot right in the middle of all those white bubbles, that's the chondrocyte. Okay, that mature cell sitting in its little bubble. Okay. Now we have three types of cartilage. They're all very similar, but they do have some differences. Okay, so we have hyaline cartilage, which is what this picture is of, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. Okay, hyaline cartilage is the most common and abundant in the body. And then we have some areas where we find elastic and fibrocartilage. So hyaline cartilage. It has that firm matrix and collagen fibers. So remember, collagen fibers are really the strongest fiber and most common fiber. Okay, and then we have the chondroblast producing all that matrix until it quits producing it and gets stuck in this little bubble, right? Its little lacunae. And then right in the middle is your chondrocyte, which is that mature cell. So what's the whole point of cartilage, right? So really it forms a cushion at the ends of bones. Okay, so it supports and reinforces, and what it does is, because it's firm but also flexible, it can resist compressive forces. Okay, so think of joints, right? Think of bones at the end and the end of the long bones in the joint. And so instead of having that bone-on-bone contact, which is painful, you have these cartilage cushions, right? Because cartilage is not going to have any blood supply or nerve, so you can't feel anything. So it's going to be a great resilient cushion. Okay, so really you find it in pretty much the majority of the joints in the body. Our costal cartilages on the ribs, right, connecting our ribs to our sternum. We also find it in our nose, right, and our trachea. So the rings that keep our trachea open is cartilage. Okay. Now, elastic cartilage, again, it's similar to hyaline cartilage, but we see these dark elastic fibers. So don't get confused between elastic connective tissue and elastic cartilage. So we have those two different types of connective tissues that have elastic in them, elastic fibers in them. Okay. So these guys maintain the shape, but they have a great flexibility. So even greater flexibility than our hyaline cartilage. So really think your ear, right? You can fold your ear pretty much all the way over and it springs right back into place, right? So this is elastic cartilage. So your nose is hyaline cartilage, and yeah, it may move a little bit, right? But your ear is elastic cartilage, and it moves a lot more, okay? It's also found in the epiglottis, which is in the back of our throat, which is like a flap that covers the trachea when we swallow. So it's very flexible flap that covers the trachea so that you don't inhale your food, right? So very important structure in swallowing. And our last type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. Again, we have very similar to hyaline, but the matrix is just kind of less firm, and those collagen fibers are not as well packed together. Okay, so it's very different than hyaline cartilage. It doesn't absorb as much shock as hyaline cartilage, but it does do pretty good with compressive forces. Okay. So not as good as hyaline cartilage, but we find fibrocartilage in only a couple places. So the discs in our vertebrae, so those intervertebral discs are made up of some fibrocartilage. The pubic symphysis, so in our pelvic bone, it comes together with fibrocartilage. And then in our knee joint as well, the menisci, the little discs that are found in our knee. So there are certain places where we do see fibrocartilage, but again, the majority of the cartilage in the body is hyaline cartilage. So now our third type of connective tissue is bone. So we've talked about connective tissue proper, cartilage, and now bone. So the special thing about bone is the extracellular matrix. So it's very similar to cartilage because it has a lot of collagen fibers, which makes it quite flexible. Okay, I know you might think, okay, wait, bone is not flexible, but it actually really is flexible. But the big thing is it contains inorganic calcium salts. So we said we store calcium in our bones. And so it's in the extracellular matrix. And that's what gives the bone its hard structure, very hard, firm structure. Okay? So it has inorganic material as well as our organic collagen fibers. Now, the cell types in bone are osteoblasts. So we said osteoblasts are, again, anything with blast in it is going to be that immature secreting cell. Okay, so it's going to be what is going to be creating that specialized matrix. Okay, so again, osteo, anything with osteo in it is referring to bone. Okay, so osteoblasts are going to be producing all that extracellular matrix, and very similarly to cartilage, because that extracellular matrix is firm, once it produces all that extracellular matrix, it gets stuck in a bubble. So same way as cartilage. And then it becomes an osteocyte. Okay, so it's a mature bone cell sitting in that lacunae. So if we look at our bone tissue over here, okay, it kind of looks like tree rings, right? So that's a special part about bone. So there's this big structure in the middle, and that's actually a blood vessel. Okay, so unlike cartilage, bone actually has wonderful blood supply. Okay, and then you see these other little dots out here. These guys are the osteoblasts that are stuck in the little lacunae. So the lacunae are not as distinct and round as our cartilage, okay, but they're still there. Okay. So very, very well vascularized. So big difference between cartilage and bone. Cartilage has no blood supply, no nervous tissue, whereas bone has an abundance of both blood vessels and nervous tissue. Okay. So now let's look at bone. Okay, this is kind of another picture of compact bone. So very hard calcified matrix. But because it has that collagen in it as well, it is quite flexible. Now, the bone that we are familiar with, right, is dead bone. You guys rarely have probably never seen living bone tissue. Very different from dead bone, what we think of as bone, right? Because it loses the organic compounds, that collagen fiber, and what's left is the hard calcified matrix. Okay, so you've got to kind of put a different spin on bone when we talk about it in the living tissue. Okay, so it is strong, right? So it supports and protects, but it also is an attachment for muscles, right? Via tendons, right? So tendon is going to attach to the bone and the muscle. Okay, so it allows for movement. But it also stores calcium and other minerals, and it also stores fat. So in some of these long bones, we are able to store some fat in the shaft of the bone. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about bone tissue. Okay, and the bone marrow also lives within the bone, and that's what's going to be producing all of our blood cells. Okay. So last but not least in our connective tissue world is blood, right? So it may not make sense that blood is in here because it is very different from all the other connective tissues, but it does develop from that mesenchymal tissue, so we have to include it. So the cells in the blood are red blood cells and white blood cells, and it's surrounded by a fluid matrix, which is the plasma. Okay, but again, our red blood cells and our white blood cells do not produce the plasma like our other connective tissue cells. Okay, but it's going to be transporting gases and nutrients, but also the wastes. Okay, and it does live within the blood vessels. Okay, we shouldn't see blood outside the blood vessels. So again, you might be overwhelmed, right? So we talked about all of our epithelial tissue, and we had that good table there. And now we have our connective tissue table as well in the book. So if you, it's not a bad idea to maybe start some flashcards with these guys, you know, to get the similarities and the differences between all these tissue types. Okay. So now that we have covered both epithelial and connective tissue, let's talk a little bit more about membranes. So a membrane is both epithelial and connective tissues together. So you have an epithelial sheet plus that underlying connective tissue, right? Remember, we said basement membrane. So basement membrane is that lamina propria from the epithelial side with that connective tissue underneath. And these guys are going to cover broad areas of the body, right? So what are our three types of membranes? And you guys have already seen one of them in our first lecture. Serous membranes. So these guys are going to line these cavities inside the body. So do you remember your 3 P's, your serous cavities, right? So remember we said that there's going to be 2 membranes that are going to make up that serous cavity, right? You have a parietal membrane and a visceral membrane. Well, the membrane itself is made up of simple squamous epithelium, which we call a mesothelium, but you don't have to worry too much about that, over an areolar connective tissue. And that serous membrane is what is producing that serous fluid, which is in between the 2 membranes, creating a nice cushion, you know, decrease friction across the surface when those organs move. Our second type of membrane is a mucous membrane. Okay, now this is going to line all of our hollow organs that open to the surface, right? So respiratory system, right? So in our nose, right, that opens to the outer world. The digestive system, right? Our mouth opens up to the outside world. Reproductive, right? The urethra, the vagina opens up to the outside world. And the urinary tract, right? So the urethra is kind of both in reproductive and urinary systems, but the urinary tract as well, okay? So what's our last one? Cutaneous membrane. So anything with cutaneous is going to be skin. So the epidermis is going to be our epithelial tissue, that stratified squamous epithelium, keratinized, and we'll talk a lot more about the skin, over the dermis. And the dermis is our connective tissue part. And you might remember what type of connective tissue that was. Does anyone remember? That's right, dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, and this is a dry membrane. So serous membranes and mucous membranes are wet membranes, right? They're inside the body. Whereas the cutaneous membrane is dry and it's covering the entire surface of the body. So it's just a good picture from your book to remember our different membranes. So cutaneous membrane is the skin. Mucous membrane is lining all those inner tubes of the body, right? Respiratory system, digestive system, urinary and reproductive system. And then we have our serous membrane. So hopefully you remembered our 3 P's. Okay, parietal pericardium, visceral pericardium. So that's our pericardial cavity around the heart. Parietal pleura, visceral pleura, right? Outside, inside. And the pleura surrounds each lung. Okay, the pleural cavity. And then finally that peritoneal cavity. So the parietal peritoneum on the outside, kind of on the body wall, and then the visceral peritoneum is up against all the different organs in the abdomen. Okay? And then again, in between those serous membranes is the serous cavity containing all that serous fluid. Okay? So now our third tissue type is muscle tissue. And the thing about muscle tissue is it's actually what we call a composite tissue. So it is made up of the muscle tissue itself as well as areolar connective tissue, that loose connective tissue. So even though we talk about muscle tissue as being its own tissue type, it does have a little bit of connective tissue in it as well. So what are our 3 types of muscle? We have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Okay, so let's go through all 3 of those muscle types. So first is our skeletal muscle. So these guys are all of our voluntary skeletal muscles. These are what are going to be attaching to our bones and occasionally the skin. Okay, so and we have voluntary control over it, meaning we say, I want to move my arm, and then the muscles in your arm move the bones of your arm. Okay, so it's important for locomotion, right? Manipulation of the environment and facial expression. But what does the muscle cells actually look like? So here is one muscle cell. They are very, very long cylindrical cells, okay? And they have multiple nuclei. And we'll talk a lot more about muscle tissue when we talk about muscles. But if you notice something strange, and no, your screen is not fuzzy, is there are these lines, there are striations in the muscle tissues, in the muscle cells. So now, this is one muscle cell, and it continues, it keeps going, okay? Here's another muscle cell, okay? So this is just a stack of muscle cells on top of each other, and it's just a portion of that muscle cell. And here is all the nuclei, okay, along the edge of the cell. And then you notice those striations, okay? So we'll talk a lot more about what produces those striations, but essentially, it's what allows the contraction of the cell itself, okay? So the contraction of the cell is going to shorten that cell, okay, right? It's going to shorten from either end and therefore shortening the entire muscle, putting force onto the bone, okay? Now, cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. So cardiac is always having to do with the heart. Okay, and it looks very similar to skeletal muscle, right? So they look kind of long and cylindrical, but it's not a perfect parallel line. You notice that some of these cells have little branches, okay? So they're not perfect cylindrical cells. They have branches, okay? But they also are striated. So you see these striations in the cells. And the thing about cardiac muscle as well is that it's involuntary. You can't tell your heart to beat. You're not consciously thinking pump, 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 right? It's doing it all by itself. So that's called involuntary, okay? And wherever we see those branches and where the cells come together are called these intercalated discs. So it's a dark black line. So we kind of see the striation lines, right? But these dark, dark lines are called intercalated discs. And that is another special feature of cardiac muscle, okay? And again, it's only found in the heart. Now, last but not least is our smooth muscle. And the smooth muscle is called smooth because it does not have those striations, right? So it looks very different than those other two muscle types. So no striations, nice and smooth, and the cells are more what we call spindeloid shape, meaning it kind of comes to a point on either end. It's not cylindrical, okay? And it has centralized nuclei, so they're not on the periphery. Okay? And the smooth muscle is found in the walls of hollow organs. So in the digestive system, in the respiratory system, the urinary and reproductive systems. Okay? So it propels substances or even objects through those hollow tubes or the hollow organs. And again, it's involuntary, right? You can't say, okay, squish my food from my stomach to my small intestine, right? It's doing it all on its own. So skeletal muscle is our only voluntary muscle. Both cardiac and smooth muscle are involuntary. So our last and final tissue type is nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is only found in the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves, okay? And we have two different types of cells in nervous tissue. You may think, okay, we have neurons, right? We definitely know about neurons. Neurons are our large cells that are going to generate and conduct nerve impulses. So they're kind of our main players, right? They're what really are doing the heavy lifting in the nervous tissue. And they're very large cells with lots of branches. But we only have very few of them. So if you look at our picture of the nervous tissue over here, we only really see 2, maybe 3 neurons. Okay, they look kind of like aliens. Okay, but if you look at the rest of the tissue, there's all these little purple dots. Well, those are the neuroglia. Okay, and neuroglia are the supporting cells. They're going to help support the neurons. Okay, so they're very small, but there are many, many of them. They definitely outnumber the neurons in the nervous tissue. And what they do is they help to nourish, insulate, and protect those neurons. So the neurons are very special, obviously very specialized cells, and you're born with the number of neurons you'll have for the rest of your life. So the neuroglia are kind of like the babysitter cells to try to keep those neurons living for your entire life. Okay, because once you lose a neuron, it's not coming back. Okay. So let's look at this nervous tissue. Okay, so these large neurons have huge cell bodies with lots of branches. Okay, and there's going to be one big branch, and that's going to be called an axon. And the axon is kind of hard to tell maybe which one it is under the microscope. Okay, so I would never ask you where is the axon of the neuron. Okay. But essentially what it does is it generates an electrical signal, and it sends that signal through the axon to either another neuron or to a tissue, some sort of effector, cell, muscle, gland, something that it's going to stimulate. Okay. And again, we only find nervous tissue in our brain, spinal cord, and nerves. So now that we know a little bit about all four of our tissue types in the body, what happens if we injure tissue, right? What happens? And there's really two types of response to injury. We have the inflammatory response and the immune response. So we're going to focus a little more on the inflammatory response because later in the course we're going to talk all about the immune response. So what's the difference? The inflammatory response is super fast. It's very acute. It's ready. It's right there. It's going to act right away, right? As soon as you cut yourself, it's going to get swollen. It's going to get painful. It's going to get warm. It's going to turn red. That's the inflammatory response. It's non-specific. It doesn't care what caused that injury. It's going to have the same reaction. And it's localized, right? It's right around the site of injury. Okay, and the whole point is to try to keep it localized. It's try to, it's damage control. It's going to try to keep that damage where it is. Okay, and that's the whole job of the inflammatory response. Now, the immune response takes a lot longer to develop, and it's very specific. Okay, so these immune cells seek and destroy very specific microorganisms. Okay, so say you cut yourself, right? You're going to have that immediate inflammatory response. Okay, and then you're going to say, okay, is there maybe a bacteria that got in there, a virus that got in there, and then that immune cell that is responsive to that bacteria is going to mount an immune response to destroy that one type of microorganism. Okay, so it's very effective and it's very good at its job, but it takes a lot longer to develop, and it's very specific to that type of microorganism. Okay, so that's the difference between inflammatory and immune responses. So let's talk a little bit more about the inflammatory response, since that's kind of what we're going to focus on, and we're going to talk more about the immune response in the immune lecture. So what are those acute inflammatory symptoms, right? It gets hot, it gets red, it gets swollen, and it gets painful, right? That's kind of the classic inflammation response. Now, what causes it? Well, what happens is you get this histamine release by these inflammatory cells. And what histamine does is it creates the capillaries to be permeable. So it increases the permeability of the capillaries. What does that mean? That means that those blood vessels, those capillaries, become leaky. So they leak out the blood vessel, they leak out the fluid and the blood cells. Okay. So, since it's leaking fluid out of the blood cells, we get edema. And so edema is just a technical term for fluid accumulation in the tissue. Okay? And that fluid is leaking from those capillaries. So what is the function of this? Why do we do this, right? What's the point? Well, what it does is the fluid is going to help dilute any sort of toxin that might be secreted by any sort of microorganism, such as bacteria. But what also happens is because it's leaking out some of the cell contents from the blood, it's going to bring oxygen, nutrients, and clotting proteins, clotting factors, and platelets to the area of damage. Okay? But it also brings in those white blood cells and antibodies. And that is how we set up then for the immune response. So then that white blood cell is able to say, hey, it's this type of bacteria. Let's kill that bacteria, okay? So now how do we repair that injury, right? So after inflammation kind of does its damage control, sets up a clot, right? Those clotting factors come in, make a clot. What happens, okay? Well, we have some organization. So the clot is replaced by granulation tissue. So granulation tissue is kind of like a Band-Aid. Okay, so it's going to be the first tissue type. It's a connective tissue, and essentially it's mostly fibroblasts. So it's just going to, those fibroblasts are just going to come in and lay down a bunch of fiber and ground substance just to kind of hold everything together, right? Because the clot is very, it's very unstable. It helps to kind of put a quick fix on it, and then we want to kind of start fixing it a little bit better. So we're going to regenerate then our normal tissue, okay? So we put in the granulation tissue as a bandage fix, and then we're actually going to replace that granulation tissue with the same type of tissue that's there. Is it connective tissue? Is it epithelial tissue? And again, we said epithelial tissue is great at healing and regenerating. Connective tissue is not as good. Okay, and that's why we can get some fibrosis. So fibrosis is just a proliferation of that scar tissue, and really that's that granulation tissue. So you just get kind of an excess of those collagen fibers, you know, so you just get a really fibrous tissue. And so it's not necessarily as perfect as it was before, and it's not quite the same tissue. And so that's why we call it fibrosis, because it's just really made up of all those fibers, okay? So if we look at our picture, right, so our epithelial tissue is great at recovering. So clot comes in, we replace it, and it's going to eventually fill in, and you can hardly see maybe that scar, right, if it's just in the epithelial tissue. But if it does get into that connective tissue or even deeper, then that's when you are more prone to fibrosis. Okay, because you get this granulation tissue that then can fill in with the normal tissue if it can, right? So usually the deeper the damage, right, the more fibrosis and the more scar tissue you get. So this just kind of lays out in picture form kind of the steps we talked about, so you can read through these guys. So first is your inflammatory setup, right? So you get that histamine release, which causes those capillaries, those little arteries, to be very permeable. And so then you get lots of these white blood cells coming to the site of the injury, right? So you get the clotting factors to come in to form a scab or a clot. Okay. And then what we're trying to do is organize the tissue. So those fibroblasts are going to come in to create that granulation tissue, just to kind of, you know, put a better fix, bring the tissue back together. Okay. And then you're going to get regeneration, right? So the epithelial tissue is really good at regenerating. Maybe the connective tissue is not quite so good, so you get a little bit of fibrosis in that area, which is just all those thickened collagen fibers, okay? So now, how good is all this tissue at regenerating, at healing, right? So we talked about the 4 different tissue types. And we said already that epithelial tissue is really good at regenerating. And what does that have to do with? It depends on the blood supply. And whether that blood supply is direct or indirect, meaning it has its own blood supply or it's getting it from somewhere else, okay? Because we said that's the whole job of the inflammatory response, is to kind of create that permeability in the blood supply so that you leak out the fluid, the clotting factors, the white blood cells to that area. So really it depends on that blood supply. So just to get an idea of how good our different tissues are at regenerating, some of the best is obviously epithelial tissue. but also bone. Bone is really, really good at healing. Okay, sometimes you can't even tell that a bone has been broken, and it even heals sometimes stronger than it was before. Okay, areolar and dense irregular connective tissue are very good at healing. So dense irregular connective tissue is in the skin, right, in the dermis. And then our areolar connective tissue is kind of right under all the epithelial tissue. So again, these guys are very good at healing. Okay. What are some tissues that aren't maybe as good, but are pretty good? Smooth muscle is pretty good, same as dense regular connective tissue, but dense regular connective tissue is not great. It's not as good as epithelial tissue. So these are our tendons and ligaments, right? So you always hear, oh man, well, I didn't break my bone, but I tore my ligament, right? Or I sprained something, and that has to do with the tendons and ligaments. Well, those take a lot longer to heal than a fracture, right? You'd almost rather break the bone than have a sprain or a torn ligament, right? And some of the worst at healing, what did we say had no blood supply and no nerve tissue? Cartilage. Cartilage is awful at healing, okay? Awful. If you destroy your cartilage, it's not probably coming back. It is very, very hard to heal. It has almost little to none healing, okay? It's pretty darn bad. Okay, which is why when you destroy joints, right, it's the cartilage that's being destroyed, and then you get arthritis in the joint because now you're having bone-on-bone contact. Okay, skeletal muscle is also pretty bad at healing. Okay, muscle is not very good at healing. Smooth muscle is a little bit better. Skeletal muscle is a little worse, but what is the worst? None to almost none. That is cardiac muscle and nervous tissue. So remember I said if you destroy a neuron, that neuron is not coming back. So neurons cannot divide. And we said epithelial tissue is great at dividing, great at regenerating. Nervous tissue has no regenerative ability at all. Okay. Now, cardiac muscle is very, very poor. So again, we have kind of our three muscles. Smooth muscle being the best, skeletal okay, but not so great. Cardiac is the worst, right? Which is why when we have such as heart attacks where you're depriving the cardiac muscle of oxygen, that cardiac muscle tissue dies, and it is pretty much it can't come back, right? So very, very challenging. So now a little bit of embryology. So now that we know that all of our connective tissues come from mesenchymal tissue, right? So we talked about that embryological tissue, but really there are three germ lines that all tissue types come from. So if we look at kind of a developing maybe 16-day embryo and we do a transverse section through it or a cross section, then we kind of look at these germ layers. Okay, so again, we have three types of germ layers that are going to become all of our other tissue types. So the first one in blue is our ectoderm. Okay, so kind of think outside. Okay, so this is our ectoderm. And what ectoderm becomes is it's going to become nervous tissue. Okay, but it also can become epithelium. Okay, now our middle layer or the mesoderm, okay, so M for middle, if you think of it that way, and it becomes muscle. Muscle and connective tissue. So if you think kind of M and M and M, middle, mesoderm, muscle, but also connective tissue. Okay, mostly it comes from that mesoderm. Okay, and then endoderm is going to be more on the inside. Okay, endoderm is yellow, and that's going to become the linings of our digestive and respiratory organs, okay, those inner linings. But if you notice, our epithelium can come from all three germ layers. Okay, so epithelium is kind of special that way. It comes from all three germ layers. Whereas some of these other tissue types just come from one germline. Okay? So just to get a little idea of some embryology and how these tissue types develop. So now how do tissues age? Okay, so if we look at the embryological development, they're going to come from a germline, right, and become a primary tissue type. So if you look kind of at the end of second month of development, so very early on, you've already developed these primary tissue types and even some major organs in place. So again, this is very interesting, and you can take whole courses on developmental biology and embryological development. But just to get an idea, right? So early on, we're getting these tissue types and these organs in place. And then adulthood, right? Our tissues, we just talked about, some regenerate really well and some don't, right? So we have to take care of some of those tissue types that don't regenerate well, okay? But some tissues do maintain a population of stem cells. So stem cells are a little more like embryological cells or like germ cells, so they can become kind of anything, right? And that's where a lot of research and development is being done with stem cells. How do we tell a stem cell to become a neuron, right? Because we said, oh, neurons can't regenerate, right? So this is where a lot of development is happening. And as we age, right, so our epithelial tissue kind of starts to thin, right? If you ever notice, you know, grandma and grandpa's hands are a lot thinner, right? That skin just becomes quite thin, kind of paper-like, right? So they're losing some of that protection from the epithelial tissue. The collagen decreases in there, so it's not as strong also, because we said those collagen fibers are what really gives it its strength. Bone, muscle, and nervous tissue all begin to atrophy. Okay, so of course this happens with increasing age. And any sort of poor nutrition, poor circulation is going to lead to a poor health of the tissue, right? So that's why, of course, you know, healthy living is important. So here are some learning objectives for this chapter, so you can go through them, make sure you understand, maybe make a study guide from it. And then you have some reading and questions to cover. So again, the reading is really just for you guys to be prepared more for the lecture, or if you have a question on any parts of the lecture, you can always look it up in the book to get a little bit more information, because I follow the book very closely in my lectures. And then these are just study questions, right? So just if you want to practice, you know, I do mostly multiple choice questions. So all these multiple choice questions have answers in the back of the book. But just to get you thinking and reviewing and studying, okay? All right, thanks a lot. See you guys next time.